Let's begin with Meditations 3, which is for me, the most interesting chapter, but only because I am a philosopher of religion. So uh, just allow me to talk about it. So, existence and veracity or truthfulness of God. Meditation 3 is entitled Of God, that He exists. Descartes is ready at this stage to study himself. That is to say, his mind in greater detail, as the only thing of whose existence he is epistemically certain. The demon hypothesis and the cogito are supposed to have shown that he can know the existence of his own mind with absolute certainty. And the piece of wax example is supposed to have shown that the nature of his mind is better known internally to itself than it can possibly know anything else. Descartes begins to examine his thinking in order to better understand his essence as a thinking thing. These reflections led him to a demonstration of the existence of God. The proof that God exists in Descartes' meditations is supposed to establish the first entity outside of himself, of his own mind, as he turns outward from the resources of his immediate consciousness to certify his perceptual beliefs in the existence and condition of the external world. The necessary existence and absolute truthfulness of God are central to Descartes' effort to rebuild epistemically certain knowledge on epistemically certain foundations. He first suspends his usual reliance on the senses and his ordinary common sense belief in the sensible things that appear to exist, and looks more deeply into himself and the contents of his ideas. He reinforces his earlier impressions of what the evil demon can and cannot cause him to doubt. Let's read this paragraph. I shall now close my eyes. I shall block up my ears. I shall divert all my senses, and I shall even delete all bodily images from my thought, or since this is virtually impossible to achieve, at least count them as empty and worthless, and I shall try by conversing only with myself and looking deeply within myself to make myself gradually better known and more familiar to myself. I am a thinking thing. That is one that doubts, affirms, denies, and understands a few things, is ignorant of many others, wills these and not that, and also imagines and perceives by the senses. For as I have already remarked, although the things I perceive or imagine myself outside myself do not perhaps exist, yet I am certain that the modes of thinking that I call sensations and imaginations, considered purely and simply as modes of thinking, do exist inside me. They do exist inside me. We might think of Descartes entering more deeply into himself as he waits out the storm in his heated cabinet during the war in Germany, much as if he were in a sensory deprivation booth. Here, he concentrates on the contents of his thoughts without the destruction of the senses. He takes inventory again of the things of which he is epistemically certain that he believes he has already established in his meditations. He appears to have made good progress in articulating general principles for the attainment of knowledge, making his first reference to the suggestion that whatever he clearly and distinctly perceives must be true. Please take note of that. Here he lays down the criteria. Let's look at that. Here. Now I shall examine more carefully whether perhaps there are any further items of knowledge in my possession to which I have not yet paid attention. I am certain that I am a thinking thing. Please, we can read that again. I am certain that I am a thinking thing. But do I not therefore also know what is required in order for me to be certain of something? For in this first act of knowledge, there is nothing other than a clear and distinct perception of what I affirm to be the case. And this certainly would be insufficient to make me certain of the truth of the matter. If it could ever come to pass that something I perceived so clearly and distinctly was false. And therefore, I seem already to be able to lay down as a general rule that everything I very clearly and distinctly perceive is true. The criteria of distinctness and clarity is important. Please take note of that. Attracted as he appears to be to his general epistemic principle, Descartes finds that he cannot accept it in view of the evil demon hypothesis. Oddly, he puts the objection to the principle in terms of his third rationale for doubt, the deceiving God hypothesis, although he speaks of some God rather than simply of God, indicating that he might want to include the evil demon as a very powerful spirit under this same category. He explains that in the past, he has accepted the clear and distinct perception principle. Perhaps this explains what were actually his earlier successes in mathematics and the sciences, which he now questions in light of the evil demon hypothesis. Identifies the connection between epistemically certain belief and the principle of clear and distinct perception. He tries to justify the truthfulness of clear and distinct perceptions in spite of the possibility of an evil demon on the grounds that God exists and is no deceiver, and therefore is the perfect designer of our perceptual and cognitive faculties. So eventually, he sets aside the evil genius only to arrive at a God principle. Let's look at that. And let's begin here. In fact, wait. So lalampas ako hanggang doon sa ole. Okay. Let's read that. In fact, when I later judged that such things should be doubted, this was only because the thought had come to me that perhaps some God might have endowed me with such a nature that I could be deceived even about those things that appeared supremely obvious. But whatever this preconceived opinion of God's supreme power occurs to me, I cannot help admitting that, if indeed He wishes to, He can easily bring it about that I should be mistaken, even about matters that I think I intuit with the eye of the mind as evidently as possible. On the other hand, whenever I turn my attention to the things themselves that I should perceive very clearly, I am so thoroughly convinced by them that I cannot help exclaiming, let whoever can deceive me as much as he likes, still he can never bring it about that I am nothing as long as I think I am something, or that one day it will be true that I have never existed when it is true now that I exist, or that perhaps 2 plus 3 added together are more or less than 5, or that other such things should be true in which I recognize an obvious contradiction. And certainly, since I have no grounds for thinking that any deceitful God exists. In fact, I do not yet sufficiently know whether there is any God at all. Then a reason for doubting that depends wholly on the belief in a deceitful God in is very slight and, so to speak, metaphysical. In order to remove it then, as the first opportunity, I must examine whether there is a God, and if there is, whether he can be a deceiver, since as long as I remain ignorant of this matter, I seem unable ever to be certain of any other at all. That's a very interesting stance. The understanding that uh, unless he can be certain, uh, then everything is put into question. Descartes refers to the power of God in order to dramatize the power he imagines the evil demon to exercise over his thoughts. Having invoked the concept of God, he takes the opportunity to point out that the threat of godly power as a basis for maximum skepticism is not established as anything more than a hypothesis. He has said nothing thus far to discourage even the possibility that it is God or a God who might deceive him, and he explains that in order to eliminate the basis of such doubt, he must next examine the question of whether there is a God and whether God could be a deceiver. He makes a subtle slide from speaking of an evil demon who might deceive him in his perceptual beliefs and God, or a God who might or might not be capable of such deception. The important connection between the evil demon and the concept of God in Descartes' meditation 3 is the power they are imagined to possess in equal measure. The only difference separating God and the evil demon is that the demon is evil, whereas God is supposed to be infinitely good. Where the question of the potential to be deceived by some kind of spirit is concerned, God and the evil demon are on precisely equal terms. This makes it appropriate from Descartes' perspective to speak of the two together and to consider them both as relevant to the problem of attaining epistemic certainty. If the evil demon is so powerful, then God, and perhaps only God, could be powerful enough to thwart the possibility that an evil demon could deceive us in our efforts to attain perceptual knowledge. This is the line of argument that Descartes undertakes. By proving that God exists and is no deceiver, he hopes to lay to rest the strongest possible challenge to the veridicality of clear and distinct perceptions, and thus to make sensation-based knowledge epistemically certain, resistant to the greatest conceivable challenge to the truthfulness of clear and distinct perception in the form of the evil genius hypothesis. Descartes proceeds from his conclusion in the piece of wax example by examining the contents of his ideas, recognizing that he is essentially a thinking thing and that his mind is better knowable to itself than it can possibly know anything outside itself. He orients the discussion in these terms concerning the distinct sources of several kinds of ideas, in fact. And that's something that we have to consider also. Let's read here. Of these ideas, some seem to be, to me, to be innate, other adventitious, others produced by myself. For understanding what a thing is, what truth is, what thought is something I seem to possess purely in virtue of my nature itself. But if I am now hearing a noise, seeing the sun, feeling the heat of a fire, up to now, I have judged that such sensations derive from things existing outside myself. Finally, sirens, hippogriffs, and such like creatures are inventions of my own imagination. But perhaps I can think that all my ideas are adventitious, or all innate, or all produced by me, for I have not yet discovered their true source. That's and let's look at that. What does that mean to discover what he speaks of as true source? Descartes, in this quote that we've just read, divides the ideas he finds in himself into several categories according to their origins. Some are innate, some manufactured by him, which is to say, by his reason or imagination, as in the case of ideas of mythological creatures, and some significantly seem to derive from an external source. Descartes is not yet in a position to say that he knows with epistemic certainty where his ideas come from, especially in the case of ideas he believes to have external sources outside his own mind. Nor does he know that his ideas have such a wide diversity of sources, although the piece of wax example is supposed to show that the mind has special epistemic intimacy with its own nature and its own contents. Conceivably, all of Descartes' ideas at this stage of his inquiry might derive from the malicious activity of the evil demon, imprinting thoughts on Descartes' internal psychology that do not correspond at all with external reality. It is enough for Descartes' immediate purposes that these ideas appear to have such a diversity of sources. Against the possibility that any of his ideas are owing to the evil demon, Descartes advances the most important principle of his third meditation proof for the existence and veracity of God. He argues that whatever the source of any of his ideas, it is a general truth revealed by the light of nature. That's why he will be mentioning the light of nature in a bit there. uh, that it is in fact informed by natural light. Uh, Lumen natural, that the cause of an idea must have at least as much formal reality as the idea has objective reality. These are technical terms with an Aristotelian scholastic flavor that Descartes does not say much to explain. By formal reality, Descartes means actuality or real existence. And by objective reality, despite the misleading character of the name, he means the degree of completeness and vividness of an idea considered a particular object of thought. Although we are accustomed to think of anything objective as real, public, and independent of subjective attitude, Descartes uses the term objective reality in another of its senses with reference to the objects of thought that might but need not exist. We can think of an object either in perception, memory, or imagination and regard it as having a certain internal degree of completeness and vividness. If I consider an imaginary beast, such as a winged horse, I might imagine it as being more or less complete in greater or less detail. I might imagine the animal in very general terms, simply as a horse with wings, or I might imagine it as having a definite color, wings with feathers or fur, a stallion or a mare, an Arabian, or so on. The more completely and vividly I imagine the winged horse, the greater its degree, says Descartes will say, of objective reality. Descartes posits a principle about the source of ideas by which the cause of any idea must have at least as much formal reality or actuality as the idea's objective reality or degree of completeness and vividness as an object of thought. Descartes maintains that the principle is revealed by the light of nature, a highly significant admission that must be more thoroughly considered. The principle seems to be recommended on the grounds that to deny the principle would be unintelligibly to assert that the objective reality of an idea can be uncaused or lack an adequate or sufficient cause, which is to say that something can be produced from nothing. The standard Latin phrase, which Descartes does not use here, is ex nihilo nihil fit. It means literally that from nothing, nothing comes or nothing can be made. The idea in Descartes' application is that if we have an idea of God, then the idea must have some definite cause. For otherwise, it must come from nothing whatsoever, which is just impossible. Having suspended belief in the truth of any of his perceptual beliefs, Descartes has not suspended his commitment to reason. Indeed, his entire way of proceeding in the meditations would not be possible except as an exercise of reason. If reason supports the principle that the cause of any of our ideas must have at least as much formal reality as the idea's objective reality, then Descartes is prepared to consider a number of alternative causes, in particular of the idea of God, which he claims to discover within himself as he reflects with the aid of the light of nature on the contents of his mind's most intimately known thoughts. Descartes takes the next step in the development of his proof to God's existence. He says, wait, So here you can see the words that we've explained: objective reality. Okay. Let's begin here back. But there is yet another way that occurs to me by which I could investigate whether any of those things of which the ideas are in me exist outside me. Certainly, insofar as these ideas are only various modifications of my thinking, I acknowledge that they are all on the same footing and they all seem to derive from me in the same way. But insofar as one represents one thing, another, it is plain that they differ widely among themselves. For beyond doubt, those ideas that represent substances to me are something greater and contain, if I may use that term, more objective reality in themselves than those that represent merely modes or accidents. And by the same token, the idea by which I conceive a supreme God, eternal, infinite, omniscient, all powerful, and the creator of all things that exist beside myself, certainly has more objective reality in itself than those by which finite substances are represented. In this quote, it's very clear what we were talking about a while ago, but we can continue. The principle about the metaphysical status of the cause of an idea on which he relies it is clearly stated if we just read again the following sentences here. But it is not, but now it is manifest by the natural light that there must be at least as much reality in the total and efficient cause as it is as in its effect. For I ask, from where could the effect derive its reality, if not from the cause? And how could the cause give it reality if it did not also possess it? Hence it follows both that nothing can come from nothing, and that what is more perfect, that is, what contains more reality within itself, cannot derive from what is less perfect. And this is not only plainly true of those effects whose reality is actual or formal, but also of ideas in which its objective reality is considered. So, there you see already ex nihilo nihil fit. It might be wondered whether the evil genius hypothesis could not also confuse Descartes and lead him to draw incorrect inferences about the causes of his ideas, much as Descartes is supposed to be capable of being deceived when he perceives and tries to discover empirical truths about the outside world. This, Descartes argues, would be going too far. He does not imagine that the evil demon could have power over his reason. If the demon could deceive Descartes' reason, as well as his perceptual and mathematical judgment, then Descartes would have no possibility of rebuilding knowledge, or even of arriving at a rational way of tearing down the old edifice of knowledge. Descartes rejects the second rationale for maximum doubt, based on the possibility that he is always deceived by perceptual illusions. He does not want to reduce his state of mind to that of a deranged person who are convinced that they are gourds, kalabasa, or that their heads are made of glass, and for the same reason, he will not allow the evil demon to have control over his reason in addition to the truthfulness of his sense perceptions. If reason or the light of reason is protected from the evil demon, and if the purely rational principle that the cause of any of our ideas must have at least as much formal reality as the idea has objective reality, so that theoretically we do not try to get something for nothing, then Descartes can proceed to apply the principle to any of his ideas. He begins with an illustration and analogies involving the causes of ordinary physical objects, which he then applies to the reality requirements of his ideas. And we can continue with where we stopped reading. For instance, a stone that did not previously exist cannot now begin to be unless it is produced by something in which everything exists either formally or eminently. That enters into the composition of the stone, nor can heat be brought about in a subject that was not hot before unless by a thing that belongs to at least the same order of perfection as heat, and the same is true elsewhere. But by the same token, the idea of heat or of stone cannot exist in me unless it is produced in me by some cause in which there is at least as much reality as I conceive to be in the heat or in the stone. For although this idea transmits none of its actual or formal reality to my idea, we must not therefore think that the causes, must be less real. Rather, the nature of the idea itself is such that it requires no other formal reality other outside itself, except what it borrows from my thought, or which it is a mode. Descartes thinks that from the light of nature alone, he can prove that if he has any ideas whose cause entails greater formal reality than can be provided by his own mind, its faculties, or any of its ideas, then there must exist something beyond or outside of his mind as the cause of its ideas. Then there must exist something beyond or outside of his mind as the cause of the ideas. This is the essential next step in Descartes' efforts to rebuild knowledge, extending epistemic certainty by the light of nature, first to the epistemically certain existence of his own mind in the cogito sum, and now to the equally epistemically certain existence of something outside of his own mind. Although all of these is supposed to occur in spite of the evil demon, or at least the hypothesis that there could be an evil demon who acts viciously to confuse and deceive our minds, as Descartes puts it, in that case, he will have proved from the light of nature and his mind's examination of its own intimate ideas that he himself cannot be the cause of the idea, and that therefore he's not alone in the world. Let's look at just a minute. Let me look for that quote. Sana, I was reading it a while ago. Let's take it from here. Yeah, we can begin at the stop. And the longer and more carefully I examine all these things, the more clearly and distinctly I realize they are true. But what conclusions am I to draw from them? Certainly, if the objective reality of some one of my ideas is so great that I am certain that the reality does not exist in me, either formally or eminently, and therefore that I myself cannot be the cause of this idea, it necessarily follows that I am not alone in the world, but that some other thing also exists that is the cause of this idea. But if, in fact, no such idea is found in me, I shall certainly have no argument that can convince me with certainty of the existence of anything distinct from myself, separate from me, other than me. That's what he's saying. For I have examined all these things very closely, and up to now I have found no other such argument. Um, that is a very interesting idea, right? That it's like an argument from perfection. If we follow, for example, um, Thomas Aquinas. With the framework in place, Descartes turns to consider his idea of God. He asks whether his own mind or something else other than God could possibly be the cause of his idea of God. Given the principle revealed by the demon proof, light of nature, that the cause of any of his ideas must have at least any formal reality as the idea of has objective reality. Descartes argues that no other candidate cause has enough formal reality to possibly be the cause of his idea of God. The particular content of his ideas of God and its particular degree of objective reality, considered in its first instance merely as an object of thought, could not be caused by anything other than God. Descartes opens this next part of the argument by introducing the fact that among his many ideas, as he reflects on the contents of his thoughts, is in fact the idea of God. Let's continue the next paragraph. Of all of these ideas I have, apart from the one that represents me to myself, about which there can be no difficulty here, one represents God, others bodily and inanimate things, others angels, others animals, and others, finally, other human beings like myself. Interesting, right? Uh, the causes of most, even virtually all of his ideas, Descartes acknowledges, need not be the things represented by or in the ideas. The idea of God, on the contrary, for very interesting reasons, turns out to be the only exemption. If the idea of God cannot be caused by anything with less formal reality than God, then God exists. Let's read this very long quotation. As regard the ideas that represent other human beings or animals or angels, I can easily see that they might have been put together from the ideas I have of myself and bodily things and God, even if there were no other human beings or animals or angels in the world. As regard ideas of bodily things, they contain nothing that is so great that it cannot apparently derive from myself. For if I inspect them more closely and examine them one by one in the same way as I yesterday examined the idea of wax, I realize that there is very little in them that I clearly and distinctly perceive. There is only one magnitude or extension or length, breadth, and depth, shape, which results from the limitation of this extension, place, and the situation, blah, 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 blah. So let's skip a little bit, no? Nangaaway na siya dyan. And then he says here, certainly, no? I do not need to ascribe any author to these ideas apart from myself, for indeed they are false. That is, if there is nothing they actually represent, it is known to me by natural light that they derive from nothing. That is, they exist in me purely on account of some shortcoming in my nature, which indeed is far from perfect. But if, on the other hand, they are true, The degree of reality they represent to me is so scantly that I cannot even distinguish between it and unreality, and therefore I cannot see why they might not derive from myself. We can jump uh, more, no? And here in this paragraph, and so there remains only the idea of God, he says. So, inisa-isa niya, inalis niya isa-isa. In which I must consider whether there is anything that could not derive from myself. By the name God, I understand an infinite, independent, supremely intelligent, supremely powerful substance by which I myself and whatever else exists, if anything else does exist, was created. But certainly all these properties are such that the more carefully I consider them, the less it seems possible that they can be derived from me alone. And so, I must conclude that it necessarily follows from all that has been said up to now that God exists. Yes, all of a sudden, he has proven that God exists. Uh, let's look at this more closely. What does that mean? So, instead of looking critically in detail at each of the alternate explanations of the cause of Descartes' ideas of God, it's very important to look at what that means first, that God necessarily exists. So instead of rejecting that, the idea of God, for example, wait a minute, I lost my train of consciousness. So that God exists is a startling result. It is a momentous occasion in philosophy when a thinker proposes to prove the existence of God. Historically, there have been a number of highly contested efforts to demonstrate that God exists. By comparison, with which Descartes' argument in Meditations 3 stands out as original and unique, although the second proof to God's existence of Descartes will be very similar to that of Anselm in the Proslogion, in fact. To secure his conclusion, Descartes examines alternative answers about the source and cause of his idea of God and rejects each in turn as inadequate for one specific reason or another, all lacking sufficient formal reality to serve as the cause of his ideas of God, given its high degree of objective reality. Thus, to survey the main alternative explanation, let's begin with this paragraph. For indeed, even the idea of substance is in me as a result of the very fact that I am a substance. The idea of an infinite substance would not therefore be in me, since I am finite, unless it derived from some substance that is really infinite. That's the first one. But we can continue. Nor should I think that I perceive the infinite not by a true idea, but only by negation of the finite. As I perceive rest and darkness by the negation of motion and light, for on the contrary, I manifestedly understand that there is more reality in infinite than in finite substance. And that therefore the perception of the infinite in me must be in some way prior to that of the finite. The perception of God, in other words, prior to that of myself. For I could, for how could I possibly understand that I doubt and that I desire that is that there is something lacking in me and that I am not completely perfect if there were no idea in me of a more perfect being by comparison with which I could recognize my own shortcomings. Descartes rejects the suggestion that his idea of God might have been assembled from a number of distinct sources. Suppose that each source has just enough formal reality to account for the objective reality of its corresponding part in the resulting composite idea of God. Could Descartes' idea of God have derived from separate causes of the ideas of power, knowledge, and goodness, as found in objects of his experience, together perhaps with the idea of infinity as expressed in mathematics, to synthesize an idea of an infinitely powerful, knowledgeable, and perfect benevolent God? Descartes denies the possibility, arguing that it is an indispensable aspect of his idea that God is a unified entity in which all of these infinite properties are exemplified in a single thing. Although it should be possible in principle to assemble an idea of a being with any choice of the properties associated with God, as Descartes himself presumably does in imagining the idea of an evil demon, when he formulates the evil demon hypothesis, he insists that his idea of God is different because of the inherent unity he believes to be implied by the concept of God. Let's read this a little bit long paragraph. No? Here. Nor can it be said that perhaps this idea of God is materially false and could therefore derive from nothing, as I remarked not long ago, apropos of the ideas of heat and cold and such like. For on the contrary, since it is supremely clear and distinct and contains more objective reality than any other, there's no idea that is truer in itself and in which less suspicion or falsity can be found. This idea of a supremely perfect and infinite being is, I say, supremely true. For although it perhaps might be imagined that no other such being actually exists, it can it cannot be imagined that the idea of it represents nothing real to me, as I previously said of the idea of cold. It is also supremely clear and distinct, for whatever I clearly and distinctly perceive, that is real and true, and that contains some perfections in all included within it. And this remains no less true even though I do not comprehend the infinite, or even if they are innumerable, other attributes in God that I can neither comprehend nor even perhaps apprehend in the slightest thought, in the slightest by my thought, for it is of the nature of the infinite that it should be incomprehensible to me, who am finite, provided that such that I understand these and judge that everything I clearly perceive and that I know to involve some perfection as well, perhaps as innumerable attributes I do not know exists in God, either formally or eminently, the idea I have of him will be truest and most clear and distinct of all my ideas. We can jump a bit and jump a bit. Sorry, because he will criticize that. And criticize those. Wait, sorry. There, sorry. Uh, I can still jump here. And so there can be no difficulty here about them. But we must necessarily conclude that, and here, this is the important line, in fact, that from the bare fact that I exist and that in me there is an idea of a supremely perfect being that is God, it is proved beyond question that God exists. Instead of looking critically in detail at the very many alternative explanations of the cause of Descartes' idea of God and his reasons for rejecting them, which, as you've seen, I skip, no? Let us simply grant Descartes' conclusion that God exists because only God can be the cause of his idea of God. The further consequences of this proof for the existence of God for epistemology are even far more reaching. After dismissing other explanations of the origin of his idea of God that do not simply imply God's existence, Descartes concludes that deception would be a sign of defect, from which it follows that God, a perfect being in Descartes' idea of God, is no deceiver. His reasoning, we can review. No? First, he says, I have the clear and distinct idea of God as an essentially unified being of infinite perfection. And then he says, the cause of any idea must have at least as much formal reality as the idea has objective reality. And that there can be no other cause than God of my clear and distinct idea of God. And that deception is a sign of a defect. Therefore, he can say that God could be the cause of my clear and distinct idea of God, that God must be the cause of my clear and distinct idea of God, and that God, as an essentially unified being of infinite perfection, exists and creates me as an essentially thinking thing, and therefore to the understanding that God is no deceiver. If the proof is sound, it accomplishes two very clear purposes. It establishes that God exists as being of infinite perfection and as the cause, at least, of Descartes' cognition as an essentially thinking thing, links God as creator directly to the veracity of Descartes' perception. God causes Descartes to have the clear and distinct idea of God. From the proof of God's existence as his creator, Descartes infers that an infinitely perfect God is casually responsible for constituting all his sense modalities and cognitive abilities. Together with the assumption that deceit is a sign of defect, it follows that God is no deceiver. The evil demon hypothesis is overcome, and clear and distinct perceptions are justified as epistemically certain. God's causal responsibility for Descartes' cognitive abilities supports God's moral responsibility as a perfectly good being whose nature is incompatible with deception for the essentially thinking things God creates. Descartes concludes that he could not be so constituted by an infinitely perfect, veracious God that he could be deceived by clear and distinct perceptions. As a suppressed premise indicated, Descartes needs to assume that his thinking is not constituted by a collaboration of God and the evil demon, but that if God is his creator, then the demon cannot have deceitfully constituted or interfered, even in part, with his way of knowing. The implication is that the evil demon hypothesis is false, that Descartes, in advancing his epistemic project, can know with epistemic certainty that his clear and distinct perceptions are demon-proof, and that his clear and distinct perceptions truthfully represents the true condition of an external real world. If we look back, Descartes will argue, I am rationally justified in doubting the truthfulness of the representations of reality in my clear and distinct ideas, if and only if it is possible that my sense modalities and cognitive abilities are deceitfully constituted or interfered by the evil demon. But if God creates me as an essentially thinking thing, and therefore is responsible for my cognition, and if God is no deceiver, then my cognitive abilities cannot be constituted or interfered with even in part by an evil demon, then my cognitive abilities cannot be constituted or interfered with by an evil demon, and therefore that I am not rationally justified in doubting the truthfulness of all representations of reality in my mind and distinct perceptions. My clear and distinct perceptions, therefore, are epistemically certain. And therefore, you see there two proofs, no? Descartes' argument that God exists and is no deceiver, and that Descartes and his argument against the evil demon hypothesis. So far, what we've arrived at clears away the only rational basis for methodological doubt, of which Descartes approves in Meditation 1. If there is no possibility for Descartes' cognitive abilities to be constituted by or interfered with by an evil demon, then there remains no rational justification for methodological doubt about the truthfulness of clear and distinct perceptions. The foundations for epistemically certain empirical knowledge are established when Descartes demonstrates that the thinking subject is not deceived by the only available evidence of an external reality by truthful representation in clear and distinct ideas. It's worth remarking, as we conclude this section on Descartes' proof for the existence and veracity of God, that Descartes offers a more conventional proof for the existence of God later in Meditations 5. We shall not consider Descartes' second argument for God, except to note that it is similar in form to what is usually called as Anselm of Canterbury's Id quo maius cogitari nequit, or IQMCN, or G.W. Leibniz's ontological proof for the existence of God. And take note, I never called Anselm's proof as ontological. The essence of that proof is to say that God exists because the definition or concept of God is of a divine person possessing all perfections, even if Anselm never really used perfections, so it's not an ontological argument, in fact. And that for such a person, it would be a perfection to exist rather than not exist, or that God must exist in order to be the greatest conceivable being. Descartes offers a version of the ontological proof, but not Anselm. But Descartes, yes, Arguing to think clearly and distinctly of God as a being with all perfections who nevertheless does not exist would be tantamount to thinking of a mountain without a valley. The argument is meant to bolster Descartes' position that an existent God, who is no deceiver, would not permit us to be confused or deceived by an evil demon. He thereby provides another reason to eliminate the strongest imaginable basis for doubting perceptual evidence about the existence and condition of the external world. It is also worth remarking, in connection with the relation between his two proofs for the existence of God, that Descartes regards the inference in meditation 3 as the main and most important of the two. In the synopsis at the beginning of this text, which I also showed to you in the earlier videos, Descartes unequivocally states, and we can read that so that you're reminded of it. Um, Here in Meditations 3, he says. There. In meditations, in the third meditation, I have explained my principal proof of the existence of God at, I think, considerable length. There, my principal proof. So I think that's a good example to remind us that this is, in fact, his principal proof to the existence of God, or to the proof to the to whether there is God. In the space below, please answer this question. First question: how should we understand Descartes' first proving the indubitable existence of the self and only then proving the existence of God? Can the choice in the order of topics in these proofs be detached from the fact that according to Descartes, God creates the self? First, how should we understand Descartes' first proving the indubitable existence of the self and only then proving the existence of God? Can the choice in the order of topics in these proofs be detached from the fact that according to Descartes, God creates the self? Second question: what is the significance of Descartes offering two different proofs for the existence of God? How are they supposed to be related? Or what is the significance of Descartes offering the two different proofs to the existence of God? How are they supposed to be related? Lastly, three questions. Could God have created human beings so perfectly that their wills would never make false judgment on the basis of clear and distinct perceptions? Could God have created human beings so perfectly that their wills would have never make false judgment on the basis of clear and distinct perceptions? Please answer these questions, three questions, and then I'll try to explain some of the ideas further. Like I will have to explain like what the light of nature is, what the Cartesian circle is, just to describe more about this matter. But if it's clear, please answer the essays below. If not, please listen to this very long recording, and I know it's a very long recording. Thank you very much.